This video will be a little different to the videos you may be used to in the English Essentials series, where we break down texts by their text types. This is because non-fiction doesn't just refer to a single type of text. Documentaries, speeches, books, memoirs, essays, news articles, and even TED Talks are all great examples of non-fiction texts, even though they have been composed in very different mediums. So how do we define non-fiction? Let's think back to the author's purpose. Why would an author decide to write a piece of non-fiction? In fictional writing, which are stories that take place in a made-up or fictional world, even when a text manages to teach us things about love or justice or the human experience, the author's primary purpose is often to entertain. Comedies like Shakespeare's play A Midsummer Night's Dream might make us laugh, and tragedies like James Cameron's film The Titanic might make us cry. But what both composers share in common is their desire to keep us entertained and on the edge of our seats. In non-fiction, the primary purpose shifts. Even though, say, a documentary writer may also wish to entertain his audience, his desire to entertain is a secondary purpose. His primary purpose will likely be to inform or to persuade. Some authors want to convey factual information to their audiences or encourage them to accept an argument as true. And documentaries are just one example of a medium which often utilises both of these purposes. Memoirs, TED Talks, newspapers, and many more genres of non-fiction can all be used to inform. However, other authors might wish to persuade their audiences as their main goal. But wait, you might be asking, isn't that the same as informing them? Not quite. To inform is to teach someone the truth, to teach them the facts and nothing else. On the other hand, persuasion is a little different. Persuasive composers will try and convince you that something is true, even if we can't be sure if what they're saying is guaranteed to be the truth. But don't get the wrong idea. Most people trying to persuade others aren't going around spreading misinformation. Instead, they are simply advocating what they believe to be the truth in a contested or uncertain area. For example, we would identify George Orwell's essay The Sporting Spirit as one that was written with a persuasive purpose, because Orwell was trying to convince us that sport promoted violence, nationalism, and even xenophobia, which is a fancy word for a fear of foreigners. Orwell couldn't prove any of his allegations with maths and science, but he wrote his essay to try and persuade us, supporting his position with many examples and clever arguments. A good way to distinguish between the two purposes when you come across a new text is to ask yourself the following question. Is the composer trying to persuade me to believe in something new? Or is the composer simply trying to educate or inform me about some pre-existing, accepted facts? But before we move on from talking about the basics of non-fiction and mediums, there is one text type in particular worth mentioning: the discussion. Are discussions designed to inform us or persuade us? In primary school, you might have learnt that discussions are different to persuasive writing. This is true. Persuasive pieces tend to argue one side of an argument, while discussions usually outline both sides of an argument. When an author discusses something, they intend to inform us about a particular issue without reaching a verdict, that is, without favouring one side more than another. There is no persuasion involved. Instead, there is only informing. Two different primary purposes, to inform and to persuade. Where does that leave us? Well, in both cases, the composer is trying to get us to accept a new belief. The only difference is whether or not what the composer is saying is factually true or not. And in order for us to accept a new belief, composers will use all sorts of techniques and tricks to win us over. We can break these down into three types of appeals: appeals to logos, or reason, appeals to ethos, or the authority of the composer or another person, and appeals to pathos, or emotion. Authors build appeals to logos through using different forms of reasoning and logic. Appeals to logos often use statistics and graphs, as well as reasoned arguments. Some arguments include cause and effect logic, which is where a composer will make a logical argument to try and prove that a phenomenon caused a certain effect. For example, a writer might try and prove that the coronavirus emergency was responsible for students struggling with schoolwork in 2020. Another common appeal to logos is the hypothetical example, which is where a writer will use a made-up example rather than a real-life example to illustrate a point. This is also the most common type of appeal in documentaries and other informative texts. The composer wants us to know they are being impartial. They're only looking at the facts without taking sides or being biased. Persuasive texts will use appeals to logos too, but tend to also include other types of appeals. Appeals to ethos ask the audience to accept claims based on the authority of the composer or another person who is making claims. The most common example of this type of appeal is the expert opinion, where a composer will introduce an expert's view. The expert will persuade us to believe something that we might find hard to believe. After all, doesn't the expert know best? Expert opinions might come in the form of direct quotations or even paraphrases, but the point is that an author will be relying on someone else's credibility or ethos to push their own argument. For example, how many articles do you read in newspapers which rely on quotations from experts to back up the author's claims? A politician might quote a climate change researcher to argue that global warming is not real. Appeals to ethos are quite common in both informative and persuasive texts, though logos is still the primary kind of appeal for those writing to inform. Let's move now to the final kind of appeal used in non-fiction: the appeal to pathos, which discards reason and authority entirely. Instead, authors use this kind of appeal to ask us to listen to our emotions. The appeal to pathos is more common than you might think. Have your parents ever told you to finish your plate or eat your greens because there are people starving out there, so you better not let food go to waste? Even though there might be other arguments in favour of eating your greens, founded on reason or logos, like the nutrients in broccoli being good for you, this definitely isn't one of them. If you used reason, you could easily point out that those people would still starve, no matter if you finished your plate or not, unless you could somehow send the rest of your dinner to those in need. But the image of people starving evokes a pathetic response, that is, an emotional reaction. We feel upset, and even more than upset, we feel guilty because our parents have linked that image of starving people to whether or not we eat our greens. Guilt trips are a really common way of appealing to pathos that we find all throughout the world of non-fiction and not just at the dinner table. For example, during the 1968 Summer Olympics in Mexico City, a picture of two African American athletes, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, took the world by storm. The picture showed the two athletes, after placing first and third respectively, defiantly protesting their victory by raising their arms as a human rights salute. The pair were protesting against racial discrimination. The powerful images of Tommy and John moved the world. These two men were at the height of their professional career, but they had given up their celebrations to protest for human rights. Even though the statistics showed that racial discrimination and racial inequality were huge areas of concern in America, people just weren't paying attention. Images of these two men raised more public awareness for the fight for racial equality than any statistic ever could. Sometimes, an appeal to pathos is the only way to get through to people. So what does this mean for our analysis? In Nailing Nonfiction Lesson 2, we'll break down the three major forms of nonfiction: written nonfiction, like essays and memoirs; verbal nonfiction, like speeches and radio broadcasts; as well as visual nonfiction, like documentaries and television shows focused on current events. We'll then move on to ask how each form uses their own set of techniques to appeal to logos, ethos, and pathos. Be sure to check out our English Essentials series on powering through prose and flying through film first, though, if you haven't already. We'll be referring to some of the same techniques explored in these English Essentials series as we discuss the subtle arts of informing and persuading. We hope you enjoyed this Schooling Online production. For more easy lessons on Stage 4 English Essentials, check out our analysis of Nailing Nonfiction, Lesson 2.